Research Coordination Network, the collaboratory for coastal adaptation over space and time. The purpose of the Disciplines 101s, again, for those of you who haven't joined us before, is for scholars across many different disciplines and specialties to educate each other on what their disciplines have to say about interesting environmental questions that are either directly or indirectly related to coastal communities. And so today I'm really pleased we have two speakers, both talking on topics related to environmental justice. Our first speaker is Danielle Purifoy, who is an assistant professor in the geography department at UNC Chapel Hill. Danielle has quite an amazingly interesting background by having a PhD in environmental politics and African American studies from Duke, as well as a JD from Harvard Law School, and really brings both of those kinds of expertise together in her work. Our second speaker is David Griffith, who's an anthropologist at East Carolina University, and David has worked on a very wide range of topics related to people in the coastal environment. He's worked on different topics and in a number of different regions around the world. So I'm really pleased to have both of them here today. Real quick on logistics, for those of you who have questions, please put your questions in the chat as we go. And then at the end of each speaker's prepared remarks, there will be an opportunity for questions, and our moderator, Catherine, will call on you to ask your question. If you have technical issues and aren't able to unmute yourself to ask the question, she can read it on your behalf. But please put your questions in the chat, and then we will have another Disciplines 101 meeting in 2 weeks, and I'll mention the speakers there at the end of today's talk. So without further ado, Danielle, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marty, and thank you to everyone for being here. I'm just going to share my screen quick. Okay, great. Can everyone see this? Solid. Okay, great. So this talk, I'm going to talk for, I guess, 20 minutes, is part of, or is derived from, an article that was just published mid-2020 by my colleague Louise Seamster, who's an urban sociologist at University of Iowa, and myself, entitled "What is Environmental Racism For?" And it really takes up a kind of critique of environmental justice scholarship towards a kind of new framing of environmental justice scholarship that kind of moves us away from a focus on individual or even cumulative hazards to what we might think of as race relational development. And I'll talk a bit about why I think that's important. So much of the environmental justice scholarship of the last 30 plus years has been, and rightly so, focused on really understanding, right, the connectivities between hazard disparities and things like public health outcomes, economic health outcomes, such as things like impacts on property values, and other forms of development that kind of come out of having hazards located in disproportionately in low-income communities and communities of color, and has moved, I would argue, only very slightly, right, over the ensuing 30 plus years since a lot of this scholarship started in the, well, actually it was 40 years since a lot of the scholarship started in the early 80s. So we moved from kind of a measurement of individual hazard disparities to what we might think of as cumulative hazard disparities, right? So because environmental permits really are only looking at emissions from one facility at a time, environmental justice scholars really pushed in the mid to late 1990s and the 2000s for a more cumulative hazard analysis to understand the cumulative impacts of having several polluting industries or other unwanted land uses clustered together, as it happens in a lot of these same communities. And there's a really important level of research to get to. And I think what ends up being lost by sticking to this space is the larger picture, which gets a little bit more at a theorizing of environmental racism itself, specifically kind of why it happens. And so I'm arguing today, or we argue in this article, that a race relational development framing of environmental racism helps us to get a bit more at the why and how of environmental racism. So if environmental justice scholarship really asks, to date, is there a racial disparity in the distribution or the location of an environmental hazard? And is it racism? It does not take the racism for granted. It asks the question over and over again. And our framing actually takes the racism for granted, given the particular history of the United States, and we're speaking about the United States in this article. Structural racism is something that has been demonstrated over and over and over again, and is predictable, right, from the histories of the United States. And it happens and it manifests in various ways in every arena of human life in the United States, including in our environments. So what we're more interested in asking is how environmental racism is accomplished and for what purpose. And our case study in this paper, and I can send the link to it as well, is Tamina, Texas. It's a small, relatively small in population, not necessarily in land size, small populated, you can see it hashed out here in the map. Historic Black founded community that dates at least back to 1836, although its sort of official founding date as a place was 1871. It's located, for those of you who know Texas, about 45 minutes north of Houston. And so it's really kind of considered the outer suburbs of Houston today. But back when it was founded, it was actually pretty much forest in sort of mid-north Texas. And what ended up happening to Tamina actually existed pretty much alone and took up most of the land area that you actually see outlined here, that includes all of these other places now. It used to be all considered Tamina until about the 1970s, when the HUD Model Communities Program gave an oil baron, and I'm forgetting his name, George P. Mitchell, federal funding to establish the Woodlands, which is this area that you see here. The Woodlands is, both the Woodlands and Tamina are what you might call unincorporated places, which means that they don't have separate municipal governments. And what that should mean, right, is that theoretically that they look quite similar, especially if they're similarly located in terms of development. And you will see a lot of, so after the Woodlands was established, there are a whole bunch of other very small and very fragmented white communities that started surrounding this area that used to be Tamina, but basically kind of got carved out gradually from lands that all used to be considered Tamina. So, like I said, we would expect that Tamina and the Woodlands, being both unincorporated areas, and Tamina actually being much older than the Woodlands, that we would suspect that economic opportunity, all things equal, right? Economic opportunity and geographic location that you would see some similarities in development. Here's a photo of Tamina. This is just across the train tracks from both Shenandoah, which is another white, actually incorporated municipality, and the Woodlands is just adjacent to Shenandoah. And then if you see here, this is sort of just beyond those train tracks. There are a number of hazardous sites that have been cited in Tamina over the years, including an illegal landfill that was, it was a construction waste landfill that was built or comprised of waste from the Woodlands development process. And you see also a kind of oil blending facility here as well. And this is the Woodlands, which is about 2 miles roughly from Tamina. And this is just a visual of one of their kind of outdoor marketplaces. It's considered a kind of luxury city, and has an abundance of resources, wealth, and actually pulls a lot of its resources from both the county government and some from Houston, because of course it's not an incorporated municipality. Its actual annual budget is several times smaller than the average budget of a municipality in Texas. So it's pulling its own resources to develop in this way from other places. So the crux of this article, and we've written another article on this case because there were so many elements or mechanisms or processes to kind of follow to understand how Tamina and the Woodlands are kind of reproduced, and along with the other fragmented white, both incorporated and unincorporated communities around it. In this article, we look particularly at municipal utility districts, because if you look at Texas at large, but particularly this region of Texas, one of the things that you'll notice pretty quickly is that it's not just that their towns are fragmented, it's that their utilities and infrastructure provisions are extremely fragmented. So the Woodlands alone has 11 municipal utility districts, which are, if you don't know, if you're not familiar with them, they're these decentralized utility provision services that are bounded in an area that's non-contiguous, right, with other recognized geographic boundaries. So within the Woodlands, again, which has a geographic boundary, there are 11 of these, each providing different utility provisions and overlapping type of utility provisions. And these are typically, in this area, water and sewer services. And the way that we kind of are thinking about this decentralization, as we found, was kind of a, what we realized was that it was a kind of almost a privatization of sorts of something that we typically think of as a public authority. So what we noticed was that in Texas, developers were the ones actually driving these MUDs, right? They were the ones that were establishing them as a kind of back end way to build a town, essentially, which is how you ended up with all of these fragmented arenas. The trouble is that with Tamina is that despite having had its own water utility for at least a decade or two before the Woodlands was even established, it has not actually been able to either improve its its drinking water services over time, and it has never actually had provision of sanitation resources. So you can imagine having literally dozens of municipal utility districts surrounding this area, this small area that predates everything that's there, and still not being able to manage basic sanitation. So what we argue is that municipal utility districts are an example of fragmentation. So just as these towns are fragmented, and if you know anything about municipal fragmentation, you know that it's really long been a kind of defensive mechanism to maintain racial segregation across history. And this is, so municipal utility districts are a kind of smaller, right, even more micro level example of fragmentation and basically utility segregation. It's part of what we think of as zero-sum development, right? There's no kind of, this is deeply capitalist in nature, the kind of resource hoarding, right, to the exclusion of others in order to build up development. And it's not just a matter of building up development. It's also, as we noticed in sitting in city council meetings and listening to how folks were talking about development. We sat in on a couple of planning meetings for the city of Shenandoah. It really is a status symbol in this arena. Having your own mud and having the kind of development capabilities that arise out of it is seen as being part of a kind of competition of growth, right, and development in an area that is seen as kind of scarce in land, right? So one of the things that we noticed about Tamina is that it's actually seen not as its own independent place, which has been for a very long time, but really as a growth edge for all of these fragmented white communities. And they are competing against each other for parts of Tamina. And I just mentioned, right, that for developers, right, which is kind of related, but also a different class of folks who are driving a lot of this town development, the MUDs have become a mode of kind of backdoor white town creation, which is part of why you see a lot of the fragmentation. And really because of the zero-sum development element of this, there's in the sense of status, right? Like part of what is happening is that, it's both in terms of resources and in terms of status predicated on Black underdevelopment, right? They are taking resources literally from Tamina in terms of land and water rights and all sorts of things. Utility rights in order to redirect those resources to build their towns up. And it gives them a place to compare themselves to, as we heard over and over again in these planning meetings. So just to wrap up, so this initial article that we wrote, we kind of wrote at the same time as we were developing this concept of race relational development that gets at the how, sort of the process of environmental racism. And we call it creative extraction. And what it really describes is how white towns catalyze their own development with resources displaced from beyond their own borders. So environmental racism as a kind of impact, right? As the sort of disparities that you can very clearly see in the photos that I showed and in many case studies that have been reflected in a lot of scholarship. We understand them less as just a kind of happenstance of like white NIMBYism, right? And more as a kind of model of local white development. Because there are resources, if it's a zero-sum development scheme, which it is under capitalism, right? That what we end up seeing is that there's a taking of land, a displacement of environmental hazards, right? And an exclusion of political participation as well, all which bolster both the value and power of these white localities. So if it sounds familiar, it's one way of thinking of it is as a colonial relation at the very kind of micro level. So the three main mechanisms, as I kind of just went over for creative extraction, are theft of resources, both land and public finance. It's what we observed in Tamina, kind of a rerouting of public finance that was initially promised to Tamina, but rerouted once due to the sort of complete kind of non-cooperation of the surrounding white communities to actually get it its basic infrastructure. The gradual erosion from environmental degradation, and then the, as you saw with the illegal landfill, which again doesn't seem to be extractive in nature since it's dumping something on rather than taking something away. But that sort of displaced hazard, right, creates space in places like the woodlands that create even more value for it, right? They don't have to build a landfill there, and it creates more value for them in what they can do with the land. And also political irrelevance in terms of the structural exclusion of Tamina's residents from even basic voting power in these areas that actually have some land use jurisdiction over it, sort of determining the ways that they can and cannot develop without allowing them basic participation in the political process. So I'll end there. This is a visualization that accompanies this article, What is Environmental Racism For? That kind of really outlines some of the processes of creative extraction. But I'll end there and take some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. I'll give it a couple minutes for people to contribute to the Q&A. As somebody who recently lived in Texas for about a decade, I lived in Houston. This was really fascinating. I'm wondering, what is the answer for towns like Tamina? Is it to revitalize the utility districts? Do we get rid of MUDs?
Yeah, so one of the, so we don't make, in this article, we don't make any policy prescriptions. But one of the things that I will say is that the way that I think of policy within this context is mostly as a form of harm reduction, rather than a kind of thing that Black communities like Tamina can use for their own kind of revitalization and growth. And this is partially because after doing this research for so long, not just in Tamina, but in other historic Black places like Institute, West Virginia, Taylortown, North Carolina, Princeville, North Carolina, various parts of the Alabama Black Belt. One of the things you understand is there's a basic tenet of how governance works in ways that doesn't ever really benefit these communities. And so we have to kind of, I think, when we talk about structural racism, to really think about, when we really think about what that means. I teach my environmental justice students this about how even our early, forms of our judicial system in the United States really acknowledged that their purpose, right, was to reflect both the interests of first the European colonizers of what became the United States, and then white populations that were racialized as white. And so if you there's a whole body of literature in critical race theory that really gestures to how this operates, across generations, right? And despite vast growths in Black representation in government. So I don't have a particular policy prescription for this. I think that we have a government that has evolved, was established to maintain white power and actually continues to perpetuate it. But I do think that there are provisions. So for instance, various forms of universal infrastructure funding and provisions at the federal level, I think would be one mode of at least reducing barriers to access for some of these Black places. But as we saw in Tamina, they actually secured public funding for finance several times, public funding for infrastructure several times over, and had that money still rerouted from them. So it's not a given, but I do think that reducing barriers and having more things happen at the federal level, which is again not a guarantee against these kinds of barriers, but it is, I think, a way of removing local level politics as much as possible from the basic processes of things like basic infrastructure, if that makes sense. And that's a baseline thing, right? You can't do anything development-wise without the infrastructure.
That's great, Danielle. And Marty, your question kind of piggybacked on mine. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I want to think a little bit about, is there an explicit role for states to assert top-down control over MUDs, like basically restrict them from being able to exist in some sense, or restrict the privatization of that, or is it more about ways to encourage incorporation of historically Black communities, or somehow encourage more empowerment of those communities? Maybe both, but if you had limited resources to do one or the other, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So certainly the state of Texas has allowed this MUD situation to happen. And given what's happened in Texas in the past past few weeks, I guess it's not very surprising that there's a kind of sense of a market-based solution or approach to every kind of public provision. But so I think I hedge a bit about, I certainly think Texas could assert itself and say, you can't do this. I think that would be great if they did. I have skepticism about whether they would, but even if they would, if it would make a difference for places like Tamina, because it feels like, it's like in the words of one of the mayors of the Black towns, it's like the goalpost just moves, right? Of like how you get these sort of things. It's one of the reasons why I think, and I think this is more getting a little bit to David's question, is that some of these very basic things that are, hard that are like of critical importance for just basic development, and that would seem to be things that the state and local levels, according to federalism, right, could manage, maybe things that the federal government might have to take more control of, particularly in the interest of marginalized populations. So it's not just Black communities that experience this. There are Latinx colonias at the US-Mexico border and the San Joaquin Valley, and of course, indigenous communities that are experiencing various forms of these sort of infrastructure apartheid processes. And just like in the 1960s, a lot, during the civil rights movement, there was a lot of appeal to the federal level to intervene because they understood that the states weren't ever going to operate on behalf of Black and Brown communities at the local level. There is no kind of home court or home state advantage, right, to being under state jurisdiction, or to the idea of states' rights for Black communities in particular.
All right, Danielle, we have another question from Megan.
Yeah.
Megan, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
So your Tamina case sort of builds on existing settlement patterns, right? The stories you're telling, right? Or white settlement patterns subsequent to Black settlement patterns, or Black settlement history. And so as we think about, right, how these dynamics might be playing out in coastal communities, and particularly North Carolina coastal communities, can you just talk some more about the historical settlement patterns, and their proximity to environmental risks and environmental amenities, and kind of that starting ground, right, that's prior to some of what you've described?
Sure. Yeah. So I talk about it in North Carolina because Eastern North Carolina and the Coastal Plains region is what we also call North Carolina's Black Belt. And so that for our purposes, for North Carolina's purposes, it means that it's kind of become synonymous with where there's a higher concentration of Black residents. And that's because Eastern North Carolina was where had the largest number of slaveholding plantations in the antebellum era. And the consequence of that, and there's a lot of discussion about what happened geographically and in terms of migration in the postbellum era, post-emancipation. And there's been a lot of, and I think probably, it's a huge emphasis and perhaps an overemphasis on free Black folks who actually moved north, right, or outside of the South. But actually, there was a huge proportion, and actually probably most of the population that ended up staying in place, essentially, right? So the example of Princeville, I think, is a really good example. Princeville and Tarboro used to be all one plantation. Princeville, the land that became Princeville, which is across the Tar River from what is now Tarboro, was a floodplain kind of area of that plantation. In the lands that Black communities gained, as sharecroppers or managed to buy from white planters, often ended up being those kind of floodplains that put them at kind of structural risks for things like what we now call climate change, right? But a place like Princeville has had catastrophic flooding at least 8 to 9 times in its existence. And it's known as one of the first, if not the first, Black incorporated municipality in the United States. So it's incorporated. To Marty's question, it's incorporated, but still has these sort of structural issues of being located in a floodplain that makes it vulnerable, even more vulnerable now to catastrophic flooding. But it also, and this is another thing that I don't think, because we talk so much about the flooding infrastructure, but it also has never managed to really build out a comprehensive water and sanitation infrastructure, right, despite being incorporated. So I think, and that pattern persists for a lot of mostly unincorporated Black communities in our coastal region. That kind of co-location of Black communities and floodplains has long been a part of the history. And in addition to, and when you add on, right, the dynamic of creative extraction, because in part, this doesn't necessarily have to be, these communities are typically adjacent to each other, right? Tarboro is adjacent to Princeville and used to claim Princeville to HUD as part of its like low income area to get federal funding, right? Like there are all of these ways that the extraction continues to play out across generations, which again makes these places even more vulnerable to environmental risk and hazard.
Okay, I think we have to move on to Dave's talks. So Lori Lori, go ahead and ask your question because I know Danielle has to leave. Sorry, Dave.
Sorry. I was just going to ask Danielle what the role was, if any, of ExxonMobil in the story, because I think their headquarters is just south of Woodlands and it keeps expanding. They moved there maybe in the 90s. Anyway, does that, and a lot of white people who work for ExxonMobil live in Woodlands, does that play part of a role in this particular story with respect to Tamina?
That's a great question. I haven't heard anything about ExxonMobil specifically, but I do know that there's this interesting thing that's happening now, where there are a bunch of kind of, I think, smaller like oil businesses that I'm not sure are, if they have any connection to Exxon or not, right? That are kind of helping, along with the woodlands, that are helping Tamina to kind of rebuild its cemetery, which the woodlands is responsible for flooding in the first place because of its illegal dumping. So there's this really interesting dynamic that's happening where there's a lot of oil money being poured into Tamina right now for that purpose. But I don't know the extent to which, I haven't seen ExxonMobil explicitly involved in that.
All right, thanks for those great questions. And thank you so much, Danielle. It was great to have you.
Thank you.
We're gonna move on to David. Great, I can see your screen, David. Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Oh, let me go up here. Started. Okay, I'm going to talk today about environmental change and human migration. This is a project that I've been working on this issue for several years before even knowing I was working on it, I guess. But I'm going to talk about this mainly because we've been working on it for about the past 3 years through one of these MURI Awards, multi-university research initiatives. And my colleagues are from Columbia University and University of Florida. So I'm looking at common themes from a livelihoods constellation perspective. And first I want to kind of define what I'm talking about here. First of all, environmental migration includes not only just people fleeing environmental change as refugees or displaced persons, but also people who are moving to take advantage of ecosystem services of new, old, or changing environments. So this would be somebody like some people in Peru, for example, move from higher to lower altitudes to plant coffee trees, for example. And then also people add migration to their livelihood constellations due to environmental degradation or change. So something is going wrong in their livelihood and they have to migrate to support it or subsidize it. Livelihood constellations are really what are like sets of economic opportunities that individuals and members of households and communities combine to make ends meet or just to survive or even to flourish. And I call them constellations because they behave like celestial constellations, and that changes in one livelihood can lead to changes in others, particularly in things like time and effort you allocate to your different livelihoods. So it's like the way that heavenly bodies are linked, with forces like gravity and time and light and things like that. Now, livelihood constellations and environmental migration are intimately linked among many peoples in the world today who have real tight relations with ecosystems and ecosystem services. So this would include people involved in fishing, agriculture, peasant agriculture, forestry enterprises, and also agro-pastoral peoples or pastoralists, people who are accessing pasture lands and water. However, migration is a really complex phenomenon, and really determining its underlying causes, whether they're environmental, economic, or driven by conflict, can be really difficult. So as part of this project that I'm working on right now, and this lasts for another couple of years, we developed these kind of stylized facts about migration processes and migration patterns, just from a review of the literature. And I'm going to come back to the slide later in the talk after I've reviewed these 3 cases that I'm going to talk about today. But these are just some basic facts that we drew from the literature. The main ones that are important today are that migration builds on previous migration traditions, usually based on social networks. And number 6 here under migration processes, that many types of migration can lead to managed migration. And we kind of change that as a result of this talk. And then also people do resist migration as migration traditions begin or develop. So they try and not migrate. They try and stay put. And actually, staying put is much more common than migrating for a variety of reasons. These are in this this paper that I cite down here. So the three cases I'm going to talk about today are Honduras, Puerto Rico, and Somalia. And Honduras and Puerto Rico, I've done a lot of field work in. Somalia, I've never been to, but so I've just been reading about Somalia. I actually do hope to go to Somalia in the fall, but I'm getting a lot of pushback from my wife on that. So, so Hondurans, they experienced Hurricane Mitch in 1998. And after that, the United States gave 50,000 Hondurans temporary protected status, or TPS. Of course, Hondurans were already coming from a legacy of Central American civil wars. There were wars going on in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, which border Honduras. They, of course, have been the victims of colonialism and US domination, and they're a very impoverished country. Puerto Ricans experienced hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, but both of these hurricanes, which occurred pretty much back to back with one another, they occurred after this kind of deepening fiscal crisis of the 21st century. They were deep in debt. And then in 2015, actually, more Puerto Ricans were living off the islands, most of them in the continental United States, than were living on the islands for the first time. And they also have a legacy of colonialism and population control schemes, including managed migration. So there have been a lot of labor schemes that have brought Puerto Ricans to the continental United States essentially as a kind of guest worker population. And then Somalis, they come from these agro-pastoral economies historically, but they've experienced multiple droughts and flooding events combined with warfare in recent years, and they continue to be highly destabilized by chronic conflict. They also have a legacy of colonialism and these kind of distorted colonial boundaries that were drawn in Europe around their country, making the country of Somalia. And they had managed migration to the Arab states for oil and service work, mostly starting in the 1980s, but continuing to today. So I'm going to go over each of these cases just in a little more detail. I don't have that much time, of course. So Honduras, like I said, they had Hurricane Mitch. About 7,000 people were killed, 1.5 million were homeless. And I worked in a place called Olancho, it was in central Honduras, right after the hurricane. This was one of the hardest hit regions. They had little history of migration prior to Mitch. Their economy was based on kind of mixed peasant farming and ranching with some dairy production. Following Mitch, though, the United States offered assistance in two forms: TPS, which I've already mentioned, and USAID gave a lot of support and aid and expertise to the dairy sector, to expanding and modernizing the dairy sector. TPS essentially established a migration tradition, and for each migrant offered TPS, an additional 10 migrated to the United States as undocumented immigrants. A lot of them came to North Carolina and the South, which are primarily have been new destinations since the late 1980s and 1990s. And then aid to the dairy sector encouraged changes to farming systems in the region with more specialized production of livestock, fewer what they call granos básicos, or basic grains like corn and beans, and then modernizing the dairy sector. And then it made kind of artisanal milk production considered unsanitary. This is small scale, home-based milk production. Here's some pictures of rural livelihoods. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but right across the top are essentially these granos básicos. These are beans and maize. Then here are carpentry workshops. I'm going to talk a little about them. This over here is a kind of homemade cheese mold, but they're becoming obsolete as the dairy sector, as you can see down here, is becoming this is a very modern dairy processing thing. And then there's other things like chickens and pigs and stuff like that. But there's a wide variety of livelihoods. developing. So this is the relation between migration and environmental change there. The new migration established this tradition of migration between Olancho and the US South. So migration was essentially added to these livelihood constellations. So people who were peasant farmers or dairy or ranchers would add migration to this to subsidize this or finance it. Labor scarcities then developed in rural Olancho because youth just thought, well, I'm going to migrate. I don't have to work locally. And then they were also receiving remittances from previous migrants. And so they didn't really need to work as much. And also a lot of young adults were just leaving, adding to this kind of labor scarcity that developed. This local theater troupe came by, and there were radio novellas developed that were trying to discourage emigration because of the labor scarcity. They were trying, and it was dangerous, you know, because so many were migrating as undocumented immigrants, and they were being exploited by coyotes. Migrants' remittances have stimulated a demand for houses, furnishings, and doors and things like that, and encouraged the development of local carpentry workshops. USAID, as I said, promoted the dairy sector, and that encouraged with the labor scarcity, that encouraged people to go from more labor-intensive farming operations to less labor-intensive. So they wanted to do more livestock production because it was less labor-intensive. And so they expanded pasture land, and that led to deforestation, because that's where they got the pastures from. The carpentry workshops also placed the demand on pine forests, which also increased deforestation in the region. And I have a paper on that published somewhere, I can't remember where. Then Puerto Rico, they had a long tradition of migration to the US mainland, of course. So they have really sophisticated diasporas, you know, dispersed communities around the United States, large communities in New York, Chicago, California, and Florida are the main areas, some in Texas as well. So, but following the hurricane, of course, the hurricanes added to this high unemployment and fiscal crises affecting the islands. The migration to the United States prior to the hurricane was already high. It was about 50,000 per year migrating to the United States. After the hurricanes, it rose to 50,000 per month. The major new destination emerged in Florida, principally the Orlando area, Miami, and Tampa Bay, Florida. A lot of the new migrants after the hurricane were school children, the elderly, and the sick. School children because the schools were so heavily damaged in Puerto Rico and a lot of them closed. This was quite different from earlier waves of economic migration, which was largely young, productive adults. Existing diaspora members spearheaded the recovery efforts through partnerships with locals in their communities. So for example, in the Agua Dia Fishing Association that I visited after the hurricane, there were members of their community who had been former fishermen who now were living in the United States, and they drew on all of their network ties in the United States of other Puerto Ricans to help them, funneling money and goods and generators and all kinds of stuff back to the islands, you know, all kinds of stuff. Even little things like solar powered water heaters and solar powered fans and stuff like that. So the diaspora members really stepped up to spearhead the recovery effort. There was also a lot of concern that predatory capitalism would take place among the large resorts that would leverage their insurance payments, and they would expand their coastal resorts, which would threaten coastal ecosystems, particularly the mangrove forests. So artisanal fishermen and mangrove foragers became key providers of food in the aftermath of the storm, but they were also highly concerned about this predatory capitalism that was going on, or that they worried about. So here's just some scenes from Puerto Rico. This down here in the center in the bottom row is Agua Dia, where the hurricane, it's one photo from Agua Dia where the hurricane hit. This one over here is also Agua Dia, but this was taken in like 2003 or 4 or something like that. When I've been doing work in Puerto Rico for, gosh, I don't know, since 1988, so a long time. So just some other, this is what happened after the hurricane. There was some collective action and call for structural changes. So along with drawing on the Puerto Rican diaspora, the hurricane recovery built on the pre-existing organizations which were involved in mangrove protection from predatory capitalism already. They were worried not only about the resorts, but also power plants and pharmaceutical and medical supply companies. These are big producers that line the coastline in Puerto Rico. Fishing communities were heavily involved in these efforts because of their recognition of the importance of mangroves forests to the fisheries. And so they were very concerned that a lot of this development would cut away at the mangroves. Mangrove forests were also important because they're a site of foragers. So people will supplement their income by foraging for land crabs and oysters and things like that. In particular, land crabs, which they bring home and fatten up on cages, and then they sell them to tourists. And they're very highly valued in the Caribbean. And foraging in the mangroves historically has been important among coastal peoples and kind of adds to people's livelihood constellations and continues today to do that. So the collective action not only was for recovery from the hurricane, but also they have been pushing for new cleaner energy sources from wind and solar, and also trying to resist privatization of the public schools, which Betsy DeVos, of course, really was into trying to privatize the public schools in Puerto Rico after the storms. Okay, now let me just finally talk about Somalia. They have old and new migration traditions. Because of the way the Europeans divided up African countries during and after colonialism, Somalians became scattered across different Somali regions. That is, Somalia was a former British and Italian colony. So it was divided up into different sections based on whether England or Italy controlled it. And they were also scattered across what became neighboring countries of Kenya and Ethiopia. So pastoralists have always kind of migrated around the area, as well as economic migrants and refugees. And refugees continue today to move between Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, depending on how the conflict is developing. The Horn of Africa, where Somalia is, has long been a site of transit migration and nomadism. So there's a lot of movement historically of merchants through the area by land and by sea. And also this movement of agro-pastoral peoples, seasonal movements for water and pasture, or what we call transhumans. During the 1980s, the Arab oil boom meant that a lot of Somalis, particularly from the northern region, migrated to the Arab states to work in oil and support sectors. Now, the Arabs will never give them citizenship, so there'll always be kind of guest workers there. They'll never achieve full citizenship. They're that way with almost all foreigners, so like Saudi Arabia. Remittances from these economic activities were used to purchase vehicles to help herd livestock, but also to build reservoirs for watering livestock, and that kind of led to increased sedentarianization of the pastoral populations. The vehicles could also be used in the migration economy as conflict kind of increased refugee flows around the region. Now, here's some pictures that I got mostly from the web about in Somalia. It shows the congresswoman in Minnesota that Trump hated. And then these are the pastoralists down in the corner. And then this is a map of Somalia that shows, I don't think you can see the legend, but it shows that actually most of Somalia is agro-pastoral economies, right? So, if you think about environmental change with the background of a history of pastoralist livelihoods, this pastoralism had already established early communities or connections among different communities in region by distributing members of clans to access water, pasture, and agriculture and trade products in a variety of different regions. So there was already this tradition of migration and social networks developed in this region. These connections established reciprocal relations across groups that could then be marshaled in the event of social or environmental disruptions, so drought, flooding, and conflict. And they would assist with additional migration, displacement, and refugee flows. And typically people's primary allegiance is to what's called a diapaying group. This is like an extended family, but these groups are affiliated with one another at lineage and clan levels of social organization, so higher levels of social organization too. So they can draw on a pretty well-developed social structure when they're thinking of migrating and adding to their livelihoods. And of course, these connections also resulted in connections across regions and connections across livelihoods and participation in new and old economies. And I want to show, these are the variety of just a few of the economies that Somalians participate in. Of course, the international economy by migrating to Minnesota and Saudi Arabia and places like that, but also the agro-pastoralist economy, the migration economy, which is developed. That's to help people, migrate. The refugee economy, the aid economy, and then there's the conflict economy, which includes piracy and a variety of things, that people participate in. So there's a variety of economies, and these are only a few, there's others as well. So just to summarize, in Honduras, the TPS initiated new migration flows to the United States. Again, about 10 times the people that were offered TPS came, about 10 times that number came without documents. That led to labor scarcities in Honduras and a transformation of these kind of mixed cropping strategies to lower livestock operations, which stimulated deforestation. So they had very distinct environmental consequences. In Puerto Rico, the hurricanes energized the Puerto Rican diaspora and groups that were already involved in environmental and social issues to help protect the mangroves and prevent school privatization. And then in Somalia, the pastoralist and agro-pastoralist livelihoods provided that social structural foundation for participation in multiple economies that then extended across multiple countries, including the United States, with the addition of the ongoing conflict and things like that. Now, just to come back to that previous slide about stylized facts, in all cases, the migration built on previous migration traditions, usually based on social networks. People were resisting. In the Honduran case, I gave the case of the theater troupe. They were clearly trying to resist migration there. In number 6, when I said types of migration many types of migration can lead to managed migration or guest worker type programs. That's really more of a dialectical relationship because TPS seemed to have caused undocumented migration or certainly facilitated it in the United States. And that was TPS was kind of a managed migration program. And then economic migration can lead to managed migration in oil-rich countries and vice versa. We have a lot of managed migrants, right? Here in Eastern North Carolina, they work in the seafood processing industry and in tourism, And then migration is usually less common than staying put. Now that wasn't the case in Puerto Rico. In 2015, more Puerto Ricans had left the island or lived outside of Puerto Rico than lived on the island. And then finally, this thing about livelihood constellations that include environmental migration reflect nature-society relationships. That's clearly the case in all 3 of these cases because on the one hand, you have these Honduran ranchers, and then you have fishermen in Puerto Rico and pastoralists or agro-pastoralists in Somalia. So I just want to finish by thanking all these people and organizations that funded this research, the Army Research Office through the MURI program. National Science Foundation funded a project in Puerto Rico and one in Honduras. And then, of course, the Department of Coastal Studies, ECU, has been very supportive of my research. So thank you. Any questions?
All right, thank you so much, David. We'll give it a couple of moments for the chat to populate. I have a question.
Mhm.
So in the Honduras case and the Puerto Rico case, some of the migrants moved to other areas that are prone to natural hazards. So I'm wondering here, how do livelihood constellations, or do they outweigh perceived risks to natural hazards? And where do perceived risks to natural hazards play into migration decisions?
Well, usually these people develop multiple livelihoods in order to reduce their risk, right? So they try and spread their risk over a variety of livelihoods. Now, this can be risk to personal security, but mostly I'm talking about economic risk, right? That they try and develop a number of different ways in order to earn income, and that income can be in a variety of forms. It can be in the form of healthcare. It can be in the form that isn't paid. It can be in the form of food, that comes from a peasant farm or from milking cows or something like that. But it can be in the form of cash as well and remittances. So generally, it seems to me that the attempt to form, especially in this day and age, when we talk a lot about economic precarity that's so common throughout the world, people develop these multiple livelihoods, again, to diversify and reduce their risk. So even it might, and in some cases, it might put them more at risk, right? Because they become, say, if they become undocumented immigrants in the United States, or they participate in the migration economy, which can be very dangerous, or the refugee economy or the conflict economy. So those things can be very dangerous and very risky to personal health, but they're making a trade-off because they're lucrative trades, right?
Oh, Brad, let's go with your question. Can you unmute yourself? No?
Yes, but not with the space bar, apparently.
Okay.
So I'm just wondering, what are the contrasts or commonalities with communities in the U.S. thinking about what's driving migration? At least I picture from a total ignorance migration between coastal areas and non-coastal areas, mostly within the U.S., where the resource level and development level is, I think, at least mostly higher than the communities you're looking at. So I just wondered what your thoughts might be in comparing your case studies with U.S. communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, migration in the U.S. is we have a lot of it's quite different in the United States. Not that people don't migrate, of course, to take advantage of economic opportunities, but they seem to be migrating. Well, at least they've been migrating for many years closer to coastal regions, as retirees and also just because, what's it like now? 50% of the population lives within 100 miles of a coast or something like that. NOAA has those figures that they always cite. But it seems like now with increased awareness about things like sea level rise and stuff, principally in places like Miami, that people are starting to think about moving inland from Miami, but not necessarily leaving that particular area. But again, I would say that a lot of the migration, we're seeing rising rates of economic precarity in the United States, and it's one of the reasons that one of the things that politicians exploit all the time by saying, we can improve the American economy by emphasizing these jobs that really no longer exist. But what they're doing is playing on this economic insecurity and rising income gaps between people. So people are continuing, even in the United States. In the United States, for example, we have seen the rise of 1099 forms in taxes because versus W-2 forms. W-2 forms, of course, are paid. You and I get W-2 forms if we have a regular employer, but 1099 forms are those ones that you get if you're a contractor, right? And we've seen a growth of those over the past 20 years, but W-2 forms have stayed relatively flat. And that indicates more participation in what we call the gig economy or the contract economy. And so you see these, and that's, again, a reflection of economic insecurity. And people are moving about doing different things in part to take advantage of those so-called gigs. Some people just do it by the internet and don't have to move at all, but others, you know, do. Especially in the, if you think about the building trades, contracting, stuff like that, those guys are highly mobile. And if you talk to a lot of the highly mobile people in the United States are undocumented immigrants who are moving around to take advantage of, like they'll often move into an area that's been hit hard by a hurricane because they know there's going to be a lot of construction following the hurricane, you know, and cleanup and all kinds of jobs, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it gets in that direction. Yes, thank you.
So, yeah.
All right, Marty, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, I'll try to, you know, be a little extra provocative here. And it strikes me that there are some pretty profound unintended consequences from what might have been well-intentioned interventions, particularly in Honduras, that really struck me. And so I'm wondering, you know, are those things just kind of doomed to trigger unintended consequences? And would we be better off if we just free up markets and free up labor mobility and allow that to, you know, contribute to livelihood constellations and let those flourish? And I know that's a pretty loaded question, but, you know, I'm an economist, you're an anthropologist, I figured I'd ask it.
Well, I do think that those unintended consequences are almost impossible to avoid because you can't predict, you know, all of the different things that are going to go on and how people are going to take advantage of things like aid coming into a country or, you know, or a labor scarcity situation. Now, the labor scarcity situation, that seems to me a market-driven type development, right? Because it was just people taking advantage of the fact that they could migrate to the United States, both as, see, once the TPS people got, and I know people who actually followed this trajectory. Once the TPS people got settled, they were able then to help other people who without TPS migrate. And that's a typical way that it happens in the United States from foreign countries, right? And again, it's just a network-based thing. But that seems to me a response to a market kind of opportunity, right? Because there was widespread labor demand in the United States during the early part of the 21st century. There still is. There's a lot of labor demand for undocumented immigrants in this country, and just immigrants in general. But so it's a combination. To me, it seems like it's a combination of both market issues and you know, government-sponsored programs and stuff like that. I don't see that there's. I think that when these disasters happen, these organizations are going to flood in and distort markets. Put it that way. That's going to happen. And look at guest worker programs. They distort labor markets all over the place. So these government interventions are going to happen. Now, whether or not it would be better just to open things up to the markets, that, you know, is again also an empirical question. I mean, because there have been all kinds of cases where that has resulted in very positive things, and other cases, of course, where it has, you know, it was resulted in large-scale expulsions and displacement and things like that. In fact, Danielle's talk, I think, you know, you see what happens under conditions of just kind of open and, you know, no regulation of things, right? People that have the power end up, you know, calling the shots. Okay.
All right. I think that is it for Q&A. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Thank you so much, David,
Well,
for
thank you.
your talk and the discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And Marty, do you want to put a quick blurb about next week out there?
Yes, next week, or actually in 2 weeks, so March 11th, we have Kathy Dello, who is the North Carolina state climatologist, talking about climatology and climate challenges in North Carolina, and Miyuki Haino, who's an assistant professor in planning at UNC Chapel Hill, will talk about economic impacts of climate hazards.